Ready.
Just make sure that I will be able to. Hello? Did you see that? I don't see it. Start. Good evening. Please rise for the arrival of the Honorable Arthur LaBlonde, Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia, and Her Honor, Ms. Patsy LaBlonde. Please be seated. Good evening. My name is Yoram Abissal, and I'm the Atlantic Jewish Council Executive Director. On behalf of the Atlantic Jewish Council Board of Directors and the Halifax Central Library, a longtime partner in providing support for Holocaust educational program, thank you all for being here tonight. To begin, it is important for us to acknowledge that our program in the Central Library is located in the Mi'kmaqi, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship first signed with the British Crown in 1725. We welcome you all to our annual Holocaust Remembrance Day commemoration program and extend a warm welcome to this evening to our guest speaker, Holocaust survivor, Mr. Israel Unger, and Olga Milosevich, as well as a special thank to His Honor, the Honorable Arthur LaBlonde, Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia, and Her Honor, Madame Patsy LaBlonde. Also, we would like to recognize MLA New Democratic Party leader Claudia Chander, MLA Gary Burrell, MLA Tony Inch, MLA L'Oreal Nicole, Sam Austin, U.S. Consul Daniel Birmingham, Consul General of France Province Atlantic de Canada, John Schitter, Joe Sakora, Honorary Consul of the Republic of Poland from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. I would like to introduce Edna Levine, the AJC Director of Community Engagement, to provide opening remarks.
Thank you, Yoram. This evening is Holocaust Remembrance Day, Yom HaShoah in Hebrew. In Israel, it is a national day of commemoration on which the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust are memorialized. 78 years after the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, the world's oldest hatred, is not only still felt around the world, but has been on the rise and has the frequency of violent attacks. To effectively confront the age-old hatred of anti-Semitism, is it important that governments, civil society, and organizations form a united front. Anti-Semitism doesn't just appear in media, in schools, in the workplace, in public life. It's all-consuming. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, of which Canada is a member country, adopted its working definition of anti-Semitism, which states, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and/or their property, towards Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. In 2019, Canada adopted this definition, and since then, many provinces and cities in Canada have followed. Yad Vashem is the world's Holocaust Remembrance Center located in Jerusalem. It was established in 1953 to commemorate, document, research, and educate about the Holocaust, as well as to remember the 6 million Jews murdered by the German Nazis and their collaborators, to remember the destroyed Jewish communities, to remember the ghetto and resistance fighters, and to honor the righteous among the nations who risked their lives to rescue Jews during the Holocaust. Yad Vashem released the following statement on their selected central theme for this year's commemoration, which is Jewish resistance during the Holocaust, marking 80 years since the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which broke out on the eve of Passover, the 19th of April, 1943, was the first urban rebellion against Nazi Germany in all the territories it occupied. Of all the Jewish uprisings during the Holocaust, this was the longest running and had the largest number of participants. After a few days of fighting, the Germans began to systematically torch and blow up the ghetto houses in order to overcome the fighters and force them out of their hiding places. For a month, the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto fought for their lives. Many died in traps of fire and smoke. News of the revolt spread quickly and even reached the free world, and it became a symbol of the battle of the few against the many and of the freedom and power of the human spirit. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was one of many acts of armed and unarmed Jewish resistance in response to the persecution by Nazi Germany and its allies. But Jewish resistance took many forms: spiritual, cultural, educational, as well as the underground documentation of events. Emanuel Ringelblum created a massive underground network for a secret archive detailing life in the ghetto, and they accumulated and hid over 30,000 documents, and their story was depicted in the 2018 film, Who Will Write Our History? Other forms of resistance included hiding Jews, forging documents, smuggling Jews across border, aiding the Allies, and more. Ultimately, this widespread resistance did not have the ability to save masses of Jews. The Jews were abandoned to their fate as they faced the determination of the Nazis to implement the deliberate and systematic mass murder of European Jews. And yet the range of the Jewish resistance during the Holocaust represents this power of the human spirit. And later this evening, you will hear a powerful story of courage and survival. In a small town in Poland, Israel Unger and his family hid from the Nazis in an attic crawl space for 2 years, and they all survived. Understanding the past is critical to building a better and safer future. Thank you very much.
Before I continue, I want to also introduce or mention that MLA Madame Lisa Lachance is also with us here tonight. Thank you, and I apologize for not saying your name before. Our memorial candle lighting ceremony this evening is in memory of the 6 million Jews who were murdered during the Holocaust. Skylar? We would like to make the candle lighting for the 6 million Jews, and we will invite 6 different people to the corner here, and Skylar will help them to light the candles. Each candle represents 1 million Jews that were murdered during the Holocaust. Our first candle goes to our guest speaker, Mr. Israel Unger, Holocaust survivor. Our second candle will be lighted by His Honor, the Honorable Arthur LeBlanc, Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia. Thank you. Our third candle will be lighted by MLA and New Democratic Party leader Claudia Hender. Our fourth candle will be lighted by MLA Tony Inch. Our fifth candle will be lighted by Consul Général de France des Provinces Atlantiques de Canada, John Schitter. Our sixth candle will be lighted by U.S. Consul Daniel Bingham Pencarts. I would like to invite Rabbi Yaakov Kerzner from Beth Israel Synagogue to recite the memorial prayer.
I grew up in Toronto in a shul where I sat next to many Holocaust survivors. And when this memorial prayer was said, it was very different than perhaps the way we say it now, where most of us really don't have a very personal connection to people who were killed in the Holocaust. Although my father's uncles, aunts, grandparents, cousins were all killed in the Holocaust, it's still somewhat removed from me. When I saw the people in Toronto saying the Kel Malei Rachamim, this memorial prayer, it was really very, very intense. And I just want to make one other comment about the day today, because we call it Yom HaShoah V'Hagvura was the original name. It's the day of remembrance of the Holocaust and its heroes. And we're celebrating the resistance, as was mentioned, of the Warsaw Uprising and other resistance that happened during the Holocaust. But when I saw those people in Toronto who saw their fathers, their mothers, their brothers and sisters being killed, they didn't all have a chance to resist in the way they did at the Warsaw Uprising. But their resistance was the rest of their lives, because they did not just succumb to what the Nazis attempted to do. They moved here to Canada, or was it to the United States, or to Israel. They started new lives, they got married, they had children, they grew families, they grew communities, and many of us wouldn't be standing here today without the work and the hardships that they went through to survive and to resist that which the Nazis tried to impose upon us. El malei rachamim shochein b'amramim hamtzei menucha nechona al kanfei hashechina b'malos kedoshim utorim gzar rakia mazirim es nishmos hakadoshim v'hatahorim Shehumsu v'shenergu, v'shenishchatu v'shenisrafu, v'shenitbu v'shenechnuku al kiddush Hashem. Bavur shanachnu mispalim lilu nishmaseihem, v'gan eidin tehem menuchasam. Lochein balarachamim yastirem v'seisek nofav li'olamim. V'yitzrar b'tzar achayim ish nishmaseihem, Adonai hunach lasam. V'yanuchu v'shalom mishkvaseihem v'nomar amen. O God, full of mercy, who dwells on high, grant proper rest on the wings of the divine presence in the lofty levels of the holy and the pure ones, who shine like the glow of the firmament. For the souls of the holy and pure ones who were killed, murdered, slaughtered, burned, drowned, and strangled, for the sanctification of the name, because we pray for the elevation of their souls. May their resting place be in the Garden of Eden. Therefore, may the Master of mercy shelter them in the shelter of his wings for eternity. May he bind their souls in the bond of life. The Lord is their heritage. May they repose in peace on their resting places. Now let us respond, Amen.
Please be seated. This evening guest, Mr. Israel Unger, was born in 1938 in Tarnow, Poland. At the beginning of the Nazi period, 25,000 Jewish people lived in Tarnow. But at the end of the Second World War, only a few hundred Jews from Tarnow survived. Israel Unger and his family hid for 2 years in an attic about a flour mill in Tarnow. Their stove was the chimney that went through the attic. Their window were the cracks in the wall. Survival depended on the food that the adults were able to forage outside at night. Against all odds, they emerged alive. In 1951, the Unger family immigrated to Canada. After discovering a love of chemistry, Israel Unger had an academic career, got married, he raised a family in Fredericton, New Brunswick, and in 2013, Unger published his memoirs, The Unwritten Diary of Israel Unger, which you can purchase this evening in the left-hand side corner of the hall. Israel Unger will be kind and can sign a copy after the program will end and the reception will start. Israel Unger will join tonight's conversation with Olga Milosevich. Olga Milosevich studied music in the University of British Columbia and then broadcast journalism at the British Columbia Institute of Technology. In 1983, she moved to Halifax for a job with the CBC. She hosted 2 CBC radio network shows, Weekender and Music Alive, and worked as a host and producer. She retired in July 2012. In November 2012, in recognition of her community service, Olga Milosevich received the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal from the Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia. I would like to invite Olga and Mr. Unger to the stage.
Good evening, Israel. Good to have you with us this evening. You collaborated with Fredericton writer Carolyn Gammon to produce your book after you first met in 2007. Can you share the story about how the two of you met and then decided to work together on this book?
Carolyn actually was born in Fredericton and raised in Fredericton, but moved to Berlin and became a tour guide in Berlin, principally on Jewish sites in Berlin. She met a Holocaust survivor, and she and a collaborator wrote the history of that survivor. Carolyn came to Fredericton frequently, and on one such visit she met me, and we had a chat, and she asked me that there was a story to be told about my memories, and should we do it? And I said, look, I was very young at the time. My memories are the memories of a child, not of an adult. And I can't tell you whether one event preceded another or followed it. So I don't think there is a book. And Carolyn said, yes, but what happened after is also interesting. And I said, well, there were 3.5 million Jews living in Poland at the time. I was one of those. 350,000 survived. I was one of those. 300,000 left Poland. I was one of those. 40,000 came to Canada. I was one of those. 17,000 settled in Montreal. I was one of those. If you want to use me as an example of what happened to many survivors, perhaps we will be able to have a book.
And indeed, the two of you did produce this book. It was published in 2013, so this is the 10th anniversary of its launch. You begin the book by sharing some family history and what life was like, and how radically your life changed when the Germans invaded your homeland, or hometown rather, of Tarnow on September 8th, 1939. What do you remember of this period?
Well, I certainly don't remember very much in the very early times, but as the Jews were moved into ghetto, and as I became a little bit older, I do have some very significant memories, and one in particular I would like to share with you right at the very end of our talk. But overwhelmingly what I remember is fear. But our fear was constant and unrelenting. It was not the sort of a fear where you're driving a car and somebody makes a wrong turn in front of you and you have a moment of panic, and then it passes. Our fear was constant. We knew that the Nazis intended to murder every Jew they could lay their hands on. It was just simply a matter of when, where, and how.
Can you describe for us how your mother, your father, your brother, and you, and 5 other Jews from the community ended up in hiding for 2 years in an attic crawl space above the Dagnan flour mill in Tarnow, where your father worked?
My father was actually partners with Dagnan in the flour mill. There were 2 flour mills in Tarnow, and one principally served the Gentile community and one served the Jewish community. The Dagnan flour mill, which was co-owned with my father, served the Jewish community. When the Nazi oppression and persecution of the Jews started, they moved all the Jews in a ghetto. They seized all the Jewish property. My father no longer was a partner in the flour mill. He and any other Jew weren't allowed to own anything. However, Jews or industries which were considered important to the German war effort were allowed to hire Jews to work as slave laborers. The Dagnan flour mill was allowed to employ 9 Jews. And actually, Mr. Dagnan went to the Gestapo and gave a list of 9 Jews that he wanted to hire. At the top of that list, and we have the list, by the way, it was preserved in the Tarnow Museum, was my father's name. And he was listed as a master mechanic. Now, if he was a master mechanic, I'm an astronaut. And Jews tried to save themselves in whichever way they possibly could. So my father desperately was trying to find a place of hiding where we might survive. And he, along with 3 other Jewish men, found an attic, which was not actually in the flour mill, but was in a workshop associated with the flour mill, where presumably equipment that broke down or needed servicing was taken care of. And in the top of the attic, they built a false wall, which was approximately 6 feet wide and approximately 20 feet long. And there was a very small entrance where the rafters met the wall. And we crawled in, and we were there. There were 9 of us. And we were there for a little bit less than 2 years.
How did your family and these 5 other Jews manage to survive in this tiny space in terms of getting food and water and dealing with issues like fear, which you spoke about earlier, and boredom?
It originally, for the first little while, my father hired a non-Jew to bring us food. And that fellow came once a week. But one week he didn't show up. And the adults said, there must have been a German patrol, there was some danger, he'll come next week. But he never came again. And after the war, we found out that he had been taking Jews from Poland to Hungary. Jews were not being murdered in Hungary. They were persecuted, but they weren't being murdered yet. And people tried to save themselves in whichever way they could. So some Jews hired this young man to take them to Hungary. They were all caught at the border and they were all shot. My father, having been partners in the flour mill, knew the flour mill very well. And he would sneak out at night and go to where they actually milled the flour, and he brought back flour and also barley. Why there was barley in a flour mill, I have no idea. But apparently in Poland, this was fairly common. They would mix the flour with water and bake it on a hot plate. And I guess it would be something like what we have today, like pita. And they would boil the barley and called it soup. And that's what we ate for 2 years. Since it happened that we were over, our hiding place was in the attic of the workshop, we could, or at least my father and the other adults could take our waste down into the workshop and get rid of it there, and we would have water from that place and the like.
What about the issues of fear and boredom? There you were, young children. How did you cope with those?
Fear was constant, but it reached certain peaks because there was a courtyard. And we could see down into the courtyard because there were gaps where the rafters met the wall. And the German army had transferred that workshop, or transformed that workshop, into a repair place for their trucks, light armored vehicles, and the like. And we could peer down and we would see German soldiers in the courtyard. And we didn't know whether they were there to get their vehicles or whether they were there because somebody had informed them that there were Jews hiding in the attic. And of course, our fear would be elevated until they left.
Your parents wanted to leave Poland, but it was impossible to leave legally. Your father found out that there was a group of Jewish orphan children in Krakow who were leaving Poland legally. So he went to Krakow and managed to get you and your brother included in that group. What was it like to become an orphan and be separated from your parents at that early stage?
As with respect to my parents and other survivors, I did not experience the same kind of horrors that older people did, because I really couldn't comprehend fully what was going on. Similarly, being separated from my parents, I suppose it was difficult, but I just accepted it. I had a brother who was 4 years older than I, and he more or less protected me. I do remember very clearly going to Tarnow, going to Krakow from Tarnow. I remember that the day that my father came from Krakow to Tarnow and I met him, I was playing in the street, and he advised me that we were leaving the next day. And I recall that my mother, I was wearing a cap with a brim in it, and she opened the brim and put in a US $10 bill and sewed it back up and did the same thing for my brother's cap. And the next day we were on a train. It was essentially a kind of a cattle car, and there was straw on the floor, and we sat and went to Krakow. Very shortly thereafter, we got on the train in Krakow. It was the train arrived and people said, they're opening the doors in the front, and we all rushed to the front. And I was very small, I still am, but even smaller then. And I had a rucksack, and the rucksack bumped along the pavement as I ran to the front of the car. And then they said, no, they're opening the doors in the back of the train, and we'd run to the back of the train. I was on that train for several days, and I remember sleeping in the luggage rack on top, and then ultimately we arrived in Aix-les-Bains, which is in the French Alps.
And that, when you arrived there, that was organized by the Rescue Children Program Group. What was that experience like, living in Aix-les-Bains in France?
Well, yes, and let me just digress for half a second. The Rescue Children's Program was organized by Eleanor Roosevelt. And they took pictures of us and sent them to families in the United States that would adopt us. And I found out after the war that I was adopted by a family in New Jersey. And there is a record of that, and they had my picture. I don't know whether my brother was adopted or not, but there's no picture of him, but there is a record that he was in that orphanage. It was, what I remember mostly about that orphanage was that food was very scarce. the first day that we came to the orphanage, which was actually a converted hotel, they gave us plates of bread and butter, and we had all the bread and butter we wanted. But after that, we would only get 2 slices of bread and butter a day. And I learned very early on, or at least I thought I learned very early on, that there might not be any bread the next day. So I would eat 1 slice of bread and butter, and then I would hide 1 slice between the bed springs and eat that the next day. So I always had 2 slices of bread and butter, but I always conserved 1 in case there wasn't any the next day.
And that occurred. Smart move on your part. Your parents eventually smuggled their way out of Poland, and in 1947, your father came to the orphanage and took you and your brother to Paris, where your mother was waiting for you to return. You'd been separated from your parents now for about a year. How did you react when you were reunited with your parents at that stage?
My mother was very strange to me. I don't think I greeted her the way you would expect a 9 or 10-year-old to greet their mother now. For one thing, we only had 1 room that we lived, all 4 of us, on. It was at Metro Stalingrad. Interesting name. It so happened that in the orphanage or somewhere along the line, I had a very bad case of head lice. And my mother decided to treat that by washing my head in a sink basin with vinegar. And it was very strange to me to have her, and I suffered. I was constantly itching and being bit by the head lice, but it was still very strange to have her wash my head.
Understandably so, after having been separated and having gone through the trauma you went through. Now, your father did not have a job, and life in Paris was difficult. Your father had a surviving brother in London, England, so your parents decided to send you and your brother to England. What was your life like in London with your brother and living with your aunt and uncle?
Well, it was very, very lonely. My father had 7 brothers and sisters. The one brother that survived, he survived in a very interesting way. He had committed some minor offense in Poland, and the Polish authorities were after him before the war. So because he'd committed a crime, he ran away to England. And because he was a criminal, he survived. Now, I hasten to add it was a very minor offense, but I don't want to go into details here. He and my aunt were much older. They only took my brother and I as a duty and an obligation, not because they wanted to look after children. They didn't really know what to do with children. And my brother was 4 years older than I, so he had a completely different outlook on what was necessary and what was not. So life was very, very difficult. Not difficult, but very lonely.
Yeah.
To the point, actually, where my brother decided that we were going to run away. And somehow or other, he got to the London docks, befriended some Americans, including an American sailor, and we were going to hide away on an American ship and head to the United States, and the sailor was from Kansas. And so I was headed for Kansas for a little while. But that plan failed.
Now, your father did find work eventually, and your parents' financial position improved, so they brought you back to Paris in 1949, and then in 1950, they brought your brother back to France, Charlie. Charlie was 16, and you were 12. Your parents decided they had to get away. They wanted to get away from Europe and decided to immigrate to Canada after your mother found out that she had a cousin in Montreal who agreed to sponsor your family. And you set foot on Canadian soil here in this city at Pier 21 in 1951. And then you traveled by train to Montreal, where your mother had this cousin, and your cousin found an apartment for your family. How did you and your family adjust to life here in Canada, specifically in Montreal?
Well, I'm going to step back a little bit because when I returned to France for the first time, I recovered my name. Because when I had gotten to England, my aunt greeted us when we got to the UK, and she asked me my name, and I said, my name is Israel. And she looked at me and she said, that's not a good name here. Here we'll call you Sydney. So for a couple of years, I went around being called Sydney. When I got back to Paris, I recovered my name as Israel. My brother's name was Kalman, and he became Charlie. And he stayed Charlie. He never recovered his name. When we got to Canada, we did come to Halifax, and it was, well, it was amazing because I didn't know that we were at Pier 21. We just landed. I was very excited. I was 12 years old. I had these mystical dreams about Canada, the frozen north and the snow and the Mounties and whatnot. But it was Friday night, and my father was an Orthodox Jew, and he wouldn't travel on the Sabbath. So we stayed in a hotel, I think, overnight. And the next night, when the Sabbath was over, we boarded a train for Montreal. I slept on a bench. And in the middle of the night, the train stopped, some people got off, some people got on. There were 3 men that needed some place to sit, and they woke me up and very politely pointed out that I was occupying a whole bench and could I please sit up so they could sit down. And I did, and I started speaking to them, and they were very kind, very positive, and I gave them each a 5-franc coin as a kind of a souvenir. And they each gave me 25 cents. Now at the time, there were 400 francs to $1, so I gave them 15 francs. And they gave me 25 cents, and I didn't know how much 25 cents was, but when I got to Montreal, I found out that a bottle of Coca-Cola was 5 cents. And in some stores, you could actually get one for 3 cents. So I really made out like a bandit.
You felt
Getting
rich.
75 cents for 15 francs.
Back then, that was a lot of money.
And we didn't live in an apartment, Olga. We didn't have sufficient resources for that. We sublet 2 rooms from another family.
Yes,
For-
and you lived with that family.
For a while.
Which was challenging. Yes, thank you for correcting me on that. From there, you went on, you graduated from high school at the age of 16 in 1954 and decided that you wanted to pursue a career as a chemistry professor and do research. You applied to Sir George Williams University, now known as Concordia University. Curious, what was your experience like at that time, going to university?
We were still very poor. And I I decided for a career in chemistry simply because I could do it very well, easier than any other subject. So I thought that was, and also, I had an image of a university as being the city of a hill, and where everything was objective and positive, and professors sat in big armchairs like we are and discussed deep ideas, and I wanted that. I wanted to let reason and objectivity rule and not anything else. So that was the highlight. I found out that that's really not, that's a fantasy. But in any event, that's what I wanted, and I really enjoyed going to university. I had to work very hard. I had jobs in the summertime, I had jobs during the week, I had jobs on the weekend. I had many different kinds of employment so that I could pay for my tuition fees and my books and car fare. Car fare, you got 3 tickets if you were a student for 25 cents. But that was meaningful to me.
How did you juggle all that work with your studies? How did you manage that? You must have been very organized and brilliant.
I don't know that I've usually been accused of being organized. Those who know me would probably say that that was not an accurate description. But, you know, I didn't have a choice. I needed to, I knew that other kids got an allowance from their parents, but that wasn't for me. I didn't expect it. I couldn't ask for it. I just knew that I had to do it by myself. And I would do things like when summer vacation started, I would go down to the building where the Montreal Star was published so I could get the newspaper first and read the ads for people that needed young people to work for them so I could get a jump start on it.
From there, you went on to do a master's and PhD in chemistry at the University of New Brunswick in Fredericton. What was it like to live and study in Fredericton after you had lived in all these big centers all your life, or for much of your life? What was that move like, coming to little Fredericton?
Well, initially I thought when I came to Fredericton, I figured if I was really very fortunate, I'd be there for 3 years, get my PhD, leave, and never go back. By the time I'd been there for about a year or so, or certainly by the time I received my PhD, I couldn't wait to come back. Of course, that was helped by the fact that I had a girlfriend who ultimately I married and whose parents I adored. And since I never had any I had grandparents, but I'd never had a relationship with my grandparents. They were all murdered in the Holocaust. I thought that it was very important that our children should have grandparents. And so one of the huge attractors for me to come back to New Brunswick is because that's where my wife was from.
She was from Minto.
She was from Minto.
Yeah. And you actually met at the University of New Brunswick. She was studying education, and you fell in love, and you got married, July 6th, 1964. She was the love of your life. Tell us what it was about Marilyn that attracted you to her and made for such a good relationship.
Well, I should tell you that actually it took me 5 years to convince her to marry me. But I could have, perhaps the greatest benefit that when I started writing this book, I didn't know where I was going or what was my ultimate purpose. Ultimately, I think that for me, the greatest benefit that I achieved from co-writing the book with Carolyn was that I had an opportunity to publicly state how I felt about my wife.
Beautiful, beautiful. Then you decided, after you got your PhD, to do your postdoctoral fellowship. You got a fellowship for your postdoc work, and you were accepted to the University of Texas. How did you find that experience?
Wonderful. It was the first time in my life that I didn't have any exams. I didn't have to write a thesis. I didn't have to have a thesis defense. I didn't have to demonstrate labs. And I was instantly accepted. And on top of that, I was working with one of the very top men in my field, and he treated me extremely well, to the point, just one little instance where he was invited to a very small conference, only 30 people were invited, in Sacramento in California. And he came into my office and said, "I can't go, how would you like to go?" And I said, "Well, how would I like to go?" And so he wrote to the organizers and said, "Look, I can't come, but I have a very interesting postdoc. I'd like to send him in my place." And they agreed. And I ended up in Sacramento in a very small auditorium where there were about 30 people. And in the front row, there were 3 Nobel laureates. He and I published a chapter in an important book together. He treated me exceptionally well. I met people, top leaders in my field of chemistry. He would come into my lab and say, "This is Dr. Unger. He knows more about what we're doing than I do. I'll leave you with him." And that frequently resulted that somebody who was called Lord Todd would, I'd tell him what we were up to, and when he left, he'd say, "Well, when you finish your postdoc here, would you like to come and work in my lab for a while?" But I was going back to New Brunswick.
The place that you loved dearly. You ended up getting hired to teach at UNB's Fredericton campus. And in addition to a very successful career as a chemistry professor and then dean of science at UNB, you also served on many committees with UNB and on committees in the wider community. I'm curious, why was this type of work important for you as well as your teaching and your research?
I felt very strongly that the university should not be isolated from the wider community. And I felt, as time went by, I felt more and more so in various capacities, and certainly in capacity as Dean of Science. I wanted the university to be part of the wider community. So I became very involved with the Canadian Association of University Teachers. I organized conferences involving the university sector, government, industry. I organized conferences where we would address people in Parliament. I got involved with the business community and the government community in New Brunswick, and they were all very welcoming, and it was very easy to get in touch with them And I very much enjoyed participating in wider forums and trying to engage people to come to the university and engage academics to visit outside the university.
Very important work. You have been speaking about your experience as a Holocaust survivor since the late 1970s. From your various talks, you write in your book that there were a few questions that particularly stick out in your mind. One is, how did the Germans know who was a Jew? Another question that sticks out is, do you hate Germans? And then why did you and your family not leave Poland earlier, before it got really bad? What is your reaction to these three questions?
The first time that I was asked to speak was in a middle school in Oromocto in New Brunswick. I had been very busy with my work as a professor and dean and didn't pay much attention to speaking about the Holocaust. But since I was a professor and I was being asked to speak, so I went. And I was sitting in the gym, and all the kids came in and sat on the floor, and I think they would have been anywhere from 12 to 14 years old, and I gave my story. And a young girl, I think she would have been about 13 or 14 years old, raised her hand and said, how did they know who was a Jew? And I made up my mind that whether I was addressing a group of middle school kids or the law school at UNB or the Holocaust Museum in Berlin or various locations in the US and Canada, I would answer questions the same way no matter who they came from. And I told this young woman that, first of all, when the Nazis occupied Poland, they didn't say we're going to murder all the Jews, but they did say that every Jew had to self-identify by wearing a yellow star. And it actually became a business that some people made yellow stars and sold them to other people. And they said, if you don't wear a yellow star, the crime that was a crime which was punishable by death. So people wore a yellow star and self-identified. The other thing that I told her, I don't know whether it was in this order, was that in Poland at the time, all male Jews were circumcised and non-males were not. So there was another identification. And the third one was that your neighbors knew who was a Jew and who wasn't. In the same way that I pointed to this young girl, you know on your street who goes to church on Sunday. And you know who is a Catholic and who might be a Jew and who isn't. So there was the third method of identification. But to me, and I think I'm right, what that girl was saying, very innocently, you don't look any different than my grandfather. So how did they know who was a Jew? And to me, that meant that that young woman was not taught hatred, which is a very significant thing to me. With respect to the second question, which I have been asked in many forums, including in several forums within Germany, although it's asked slightly differently, was, do you hate the Germans? And the answer is no, because there was no unanimity, even in Germany. Many Germans despised the Jews, Jewish Germans, or any Jews anywhere. many Germans engaged in murdering Jews, but some Germans risked their lives to save Jews. So you cannot condemn everybody because there are some murderers within a group. You cannot blame the sins of the fathers on the sons and the daughters. And to simply say that you hate all Germans you're also condemning the Germans who are prepared to risk their lives to save Jews. With respect to the third one, and that is, which is also asked very often, particularly by young people, why did you not leave? Well, first of all, we didn't leave because we knew very well that Jews were being persecuted in Germany, but who knew that the Nazis were going to come to Poland and France and Denmark and Yugoslavia and Romania and Lithuania and Ukraine and so on and try to murder Jews there. So you didn't know that was the goal of the Nazis. And finally, most importantly, if you did want to leave, there was nowhere to go. Nobody would have you. There was a conference organized in 1938 in Evian, France, where 56 nations got together who all knew about the persecution of the Jews. And the purpose of the conference was to see what can we do to help the Jews. And the answer was nothing. The answer, I think it was Guatemala and Holland who decided to accept 5,000 Jews. But it wasn't only that you didn't know what the Nazi plans were, nobody would accept you.
As we all know, anti-Semitism is on the rise around the world, including here in Canada. We are seeing record levels of anti-Semitism. And I'm wondering what you think needs to be done to address this alarming trend.
Well, I would actually qualify the argument about anti-Semitism being on the rise. I do agree that it is on the rise and the record number of hate crimes committed against Jews and anti-Semitic acts is on the rise. But I think a significant number of those acts are actually anti-Semitism coming out of the hiding. You know, I think with many, many Jews, thought that when the world would come into contact with the horrors of what ultimately happens as a result of anti-Semitism, that would be the end of it, and anti-Semitism would be finished. Well, that was a very naive thought. It wasn't finished. It became unrespectable to be anti-Semitic, so it went into the closet. In recent times, it's become respectable to be anti-Semitic under the guise of being anti-Zionist or anti-Israel, but in reality, and there's ample evidence of it, that really it's anti-Semitism. It did not vanish in 1945. That does not mean that your original question that there's been a rise is wrong. There definitely has been a rise in anti-Semitism, and it seems to me that what we are doing here and what others have done in trying to show what the end results of hatred is about the best thing we can do to try to prevent anti-Semitism, but not just to prevent anti-Semitism, but to prevent hatred of any variety directed at any minority group.
Finally, what is it that you want people to take away from your book?
Well, I think Elie Wiesel said it much better than I can, and that is that hatred is never right, and sympathy and understanding is never wrong.
What are the lessons of the Holocaust, do you think? Finally.
The lessons of the Holocaust are that, once again, if you allow hatred to go on at any level, the difference between the Holocaust and other, there are huge differences, by the way. The Holocaust was very unique in certain aspects. There have been other horrific crimes that have occurred since the Holocaust, but that doesn't mean that we should not try to prevent them from happening. We will never totally eradicate hate. That would be a violation of the third law of thermodynamics. Perfection is not possible. However, that doesn't mean that we stop trying. You know, we will never stop people from driving over the speed limit, but we don't give up and we say, well, some people are going to speed anyway, let's just forget it. We will never stop murder from occurring, but that doesn't mean that we say, abolish the police and let people kill as they will. So we have to keep trying to prevent other genocides from occurring. We have to try our very best to prevent hatred from flourishing.
Israel, thank you very much for this amazing interview. We would like to show now some photos, if they're available, of the attic crawl space where Israel and his family of 3 and 5 other Jews, so a total of 9 people, lived for almost 2 years. So Israel will walk us through these photos.
Well, this is the workshop. And by the way, this workshop, the flour mill was torn down in 1999, and they discovered our hiding place, and they summoned the Tarnow Museum, who documented it. And several of the pictures that I'm about to show you, I obtained from the Tarnow Museum. So this is the whole attic, and our hiding place was over this area. And this man was from the Tarnow Museum, and he's illustrating the entry to our hiding place. This is the false wall, and over here is the regular wall. There are some implements here which we must have used when we were in the attic. And this is the front part of the attic, where it slopes to meet the walls of the wall. And the next one is the back. In this area, we could stand up. In the other, obviously, we could not. And there were 8,000 Jewish children in Tarnow prior to the war. These are, whoops, sorry. No, I have to, oh. There. This is the cemetery, the Jewish cemetery in Tarnow. There were oh, I'm hitting the wrong one, I'm sorry. This is okay, I've got it now, I think. This was a mass grave which was erected by the 200 or so Jews that survived the war. Most of them had run off to the Soviet Union. Some of them had survived in the concentration camps. There were 8,000 Jewish children in Tarnow prior to the war. These are the ones that survived. That little boy was my brother, and that little boy was me. The monument was erected by the 200 Jews who survived and had the will to erect a monument, and it bears the inscription from a poem by Chaim Nachman Bialik, who wrote the poem after the pogrom in Kishinev in 1905, and it reads, "The sun was shining and was not ashamed." And this is the main synagogue in Tarnow. It took 63 years to build that synagogue, and it was destroyed in 3 days. It was burnt down. And these pictures are now mine. This is my wife standing in front of that monument, and we believe there's something like 8,000 bodies buried here. And this is the bima, the main place where the prayers are recited from from that synagogue that was burnt down. And this is all that remains. Oops, once again, I'm pressing the wrong button. This would have been the bima. The Tarnow Museum erected this cupola to preserve the bima. This is the building that we lived in after the war, and I could look out and see that bima. I think we were on the second floor. And this is the street known as Żydowska ulica. And you may notice...
That's the Jewish street.
Jew Street.
Jew
No.
Street.
And you may notice that the cobblestones here are different from these cobblestones. These cobblestones were erected after the war. During one pogrom, one wysiedlenia was a Polish word meaning sending away, when they rounded up Jews and took them to the train station, loaded them in cattle cars, and sent them off to the extermination camps. The blood, they held the Jews in the city square for several days, and blood was running down the streets. And the Tarnow Museum preserved the cobblestones that existed there then. And these are those same cobblestones. These are the old cobblestones. These are the new ones. The Tarnow Museum erected a little monument describing what had happened there. And this is a current, or reasonably current, map of Tarnow. It would have been smaller then, and this was the ghetto. So this is the area where they packed in not just 25,000 Jews, but 42, because they crammed in an extra 17,000 Jews from surrounding villages and areas so they could have them all in one place. And this map was, this is the Gestapo station in Tarnow at the time. And this was the ghetto. And you'll notice that the ghetto is divided into 3 sections. After they killed off so many Jews, they made it smaller. When they killed off another bunch of Jews, they made it smaller again. And this was the final area till they liquidated all the Jews. And this was the main street that ran from the east to the west to Krakow that the Soviet soldiers came down. Oops. And this is a picture of my mother, one of her brothers, David, and one of her sisters, Hannah Temerel. My mother had 5 brothers and sisters. David actually survived. He was in a concentration camp. They were liberated by the Americans. The Americans were very generous and kind. They gave him too much food. His system couldn't tolerate it, and he died within 2 weeks. And this is a picture of one of my 15 cousins. I estimate that he's less than a year old because he can't stand by himself, and he was murdered along with all my other cousins. And this is a picture of my maternal grandfather and grandmother. I was in my grandfather's apartment. Why I was there, how I got there, I have absolutely no idea. But while I was there, an apartment is a bit of an exaggeration. It was one room. And while I was there, 2 Nazis came in and ordered him to go with them. And he stood up instantly, and he picked up his prayer bag, which would have contained his prayer book, his phylacteries, and prayer shawl, and tucked it under his arm. Because for him, it wasn't important where they were going to take him, what they were going to do with him, but he wanted to be able to practice his faith wherever he ended up. And when he got to the head of the stairs, one of them shoved him or pushed him or kicked him, and as he fell down the stairs, they shot him.
Thank you very much for sharing those powerful photographs with us this evening. Now, we have several minutes left. We have until 8 o'clock. I would like to invite anyone in the audience who might have a question. We have about 8 minutes left. If you have a question, sorry, off mic here. If you have a question that you would like to pose to Israel, he'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. We have...
This is just like my classes. They never had any questions either.
We have someone here, this wonderful woman with a microphone, and so she can come to you, so you can be, or we have two.
You were mentioning that people went from Krakow, from Tarnow to Hungary. I come from Hungary, and the Germans did not escape. I mean, did not avoid Hungary. They came there in 1944 on the 19th of March, and I was in a ghetto with my grandparents. I was smuggled out as a 2-year-old. My mother and my father were hiding separately, and unfortunately my mother died of pneumonia, because at that time there was no penicillin. So I was orphaned, half orphaned at 2. I don't like to talk about this. So unfortunately, the Germans didn't have enough time to kill everybody, but they managed to kill 450,000 Hungarians in the few months that they were occupying there. So that's it. By the way, my mother never wore the yellow star. Those Jews who were trying to hide were not wearing it. So that's it.
Did you have a question, Anna, or you just wanted to share that with us?
I wanted to share.
She just wanted, Anna just wanted to share that information with us. Thank you. Thank you so much, Anna.
I could comment on
okay, Israel? Yeah?
Okay.
What would you like to comment?
This was one of the amazing things, one of the huge differences between the Nazi murder of the Jews and other genocides. Other genocides were generally within the territory. Hutus murdered Tutsis and vice versa. The genocide in Cambodia was Cambodians versus Cambodians. The Holocaust had several unique features. One was that the Nazis weren't just content with murdering the Jews in Germany. They wanted to murder every Jew they could find anywhere in the world. They even had plans of murdering Jews in the United States when they would conquer the US. They had people determining the areas where the large concentrations of Jews were in the US. So that was a very distinguishing feature. The other distinguishing feature is that the Nazis determined who was a Jew. They defined Jewishness, and they defined it on what they considered racial basis. Other genocides have not had that feature. And the third feature was that murdering Jews was so important to them that they were willing to diminish their war effort in order to murder Jews. The 480,000 Hungarian Jews that were murdered very close to the end of the Second World War, the trains that took the Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz were needed by the German army to carry supplies and munition to the east. But instead, they commandeered those trains to take Jews to be murdered rather than to supply their own troops.
Thank you for sharing that very interesting and important information with us. Question over there. Let's try in here.
Hi, Dr. Unger. Thank you very much for coming and speaking tonight. I don't know.
Sorry, we can't hear you.
Oh,
Can
I'm
you
sorry.
hold the microphone closer to you?
Sorry, is that better? There we go. Right next to my mouth, so sorry. Thank you very much for coming to speaking this evening. I really appreciate hearing your story. I just wanted, I guess, I had two questions. One question is, I'm not sure if it's a silly question, but if you have read The Diary of Anne Frank and what kind of emotions that had come up for you if you did?
Sorry, we're having difficulty hearing your question. Can
I'm
you
sorry.
hold it? Can you hold the mic right up to your mouth like this?
Okay.
Maybe
I don't want to touch it with my mouth, sorry.
straighten it out like this. Try it like
This?
that.
Is this better? Is that better?
Yes.
I'm sorry about that. I just wanting to know if you had read The Diary of Anne Frank and what kind of emotions or similarities that you had, if you did read it.
I think the difference between Anne Frank and me,
Oh, sorry. Just wondering if you read the book.
did I read the book?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes. Okay. I was just wondering the comparisons and emotions that had come for you.
The comparison between the Anne Frank, the Diary of Anne Frank.
Yeah, just what kind of emotions and
Okay.
yeah,
Good
Okay.
question.
comparisons.
Yeah, there's an interesting story. He read it.
When I came to Canada, I very desperately wanted to be a Canadian. I did not think of myself as Polish. I had only very negative feelings about Poland. And I would actually sort of try to disguise the fact that I was not born in Canada. So if somebody asked me, where are you from? I'd say Montreal, which was not a lie, but I didn't offer that I was born in Poland. And indeed, when I started dating my wife, I never told her that I was born in Poland. And we went to see the Anne Frank diary. And we'd been dating for a year or possibly a little bit longer. And when we came out of the movie, my wife started talking about the fact that how horrible the living conditions were for Anne Frank. And I turned to her and I said, she lived in a palace. And my wife looked at me and she said, Izzy, what are you saying? And it was the first time that I told her that I had been hidden in a shelter. And compared to, Anne Frank had her own bedroom. They had 2 stories. They had a kitchen, etc. And what I had experienced, well, you saw what I had experienced. You saw where I lived. So I think that the Anne Frank story is an extremely important story. And the Anne Frank story has obviously touched millions and millions and millions of people. And the optimism that she expresses and what they had to go through is very, very important. And every Holocaust survivor's story is utterly unique. I've met quite a few Holocaust survivors, and no 2 survivors have experienced exactly the same thing. And I expect that I'm not the first person to address you, and if you've heard from other Holocaust survivors, you undoubtedly feel that, well, Israel Unger's stories is very different than the one we heard last year, or the year before, or the year that you'll hear, or the one you'll hear next year.
But it was the Anne Frank diary that's reading that book that influenced you to, and Carolyn, to call your book The Unwritten Diary of Israel Unger. I had a profound experience visiting the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam in 1974 with a friend from South Africa, Jewish girl. We spent hours there, and when we walked back to our bed and breakfast, we were so traumatized by the whole experience. It was a 30 to 45-minute walk. We couldn't talk. We walked in silence, and I'll never forget the owner of the bed and breakfast opened the door. We hadn't told her where we were going that day, but she opened the door and she looked at our faces and she said, "You've been to see the Anne Frank house, haven't you?" And we said, "Yes." And then we were just, as I said, so overcome with emotion, and we had to lie down. But that was how that experience affected me. We're
we're over time. Okay, sorry. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we're just after 8. We, I think, have to wrap things up now. Yes? One more question. Oh, one more question? Okay. We can take one more question. All right.
Thank you. It's a remarkable story, and it makes me think that about eugenics, and I'm wondering about your thoughts at the resilience of the pseudoscience, because you are a scientist. How does eugenics still resonate the way it does even today, even though it's been thoroughly debunked? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, once again, he didn't really get the question?
So eugenics is the pseudoscience that says that there are inferior people, and it was started by the Carnegie Foundation back in the early 1900s, and of course it was exported to Germany. How does it still resonate? What are your thoughts about this?
It's insane.
Speak on.
It's absolutely.
Hold it like this.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's absolutely insane, because we've learned so much about DNA, and it turns out if you look at DNA, we're all exactly the same. We have to go into the junk DNA to find out whether we're, what we constitute. But the DNA that replicates us is exactly the same, irrespective of our religion, our color, where we were born, etc. So people that believe in eugenics I mean, it's totally bogus and crazy. I think you're going to wrap up. Can I just say one thing? Elie Wiesel said, when you listen to a witness, you become a witness. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for sharing your very powerful story with us. And I must recommend the book. I picked it up. I couldn't put it down. It was so enticing. But I did a lot of crying while reading it. Anyway, the book is available here, and Israel is willing to sign copies for us, so that's wonderful. And I think we're going to have a little reception. We'll hear more about that.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Unger. Thank you very much, Olga. And I invite everybody to join us for a small reception. And those of you who want to have a book, Dr. Unger will sign them on the left-hand side. Thank you very much.